Hello, my name is Krista Bedwin, and this is a presentation about readability. So a lot of people write words. Some people write words that are a lot more readable and interesting than other people. And this presentation was originally written for engineers and scientists about how to make even complex reporting a lot more interesting. It's applicable even to people who just write emails, though, and you'll probably find some interesting principles that you might not have thought of before. So if you have questions after the presentation, you can email me at kristabedwin@gmail.com, or you can find that through my webpage, kristabedwin.com. And there's 3 textbooks that I have written, which you can download free PDFs at SolaRosaTech.com. So the resources for this presentation, I don't have specific resources to give you, but I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've been working in textbook publishing, which is probably one of the most strict parts of publishing because they're very concerned with making sure that information reaches students of all different levels and that it's maximum readable, maximum interesting, holds people's interest to get them through high school. We've all been through that. I've also done plenty of work with scientific researchers and their research papers, grant proposals, and whatnot, and plenty of work with consultants and engineers, environmental scientists, and so on. So in this course, we're going to cover 2 basic aspects of writing to help readers better understand and remember what you write. I underlined those 3 words because the very most important thing for you to remember is that you have a reader. A lot of people think that once they've put the information on the page, they've delivered it, and that's not at all the case. You have delivered the information when your reader has understood your information, or your student, or your listener, or your client. So it's not really about how smart you are or what you put on the page. It's about what your reader receives or your listener receives. So these tricks in this presentation help you reach the person that you're trying to communicate with. This is a very important distinction. So there's 2 key tricks, how you use the words and how many words you use. So with technical people, the higher you go, for example, PhD researchers, if they're only trying to communicate with other PhD researchers, then they would use very high-level language. They would not need to explain when they're discussing certain types of molecules or certain aspects of physics. But if they're then trying to communicate with students or communicate with the public about the advantages of the research, then they will have to change the words that they use to communicate it smoothly in a way that the audience can understand. And another very document-specific aspect of this presentation is about how you can organize your documents and arrange the words on the page in the actual space to help them be received better. So the second thing to know is that we all write badly sometimes. And many of us, including myself, write badly on the first draft. And there's no shame in that. The point at which there is shame is if you also deliver the garbage to your reader. So get a first draft down and don't criticize what it looks like. Put the information on the page. Then go back and as a professional, use this presentation and other resources to make that information not garbage, but refined. It's all about the polish. So if you can get some time and space between when you first write it and when you do the polishing steps, that'll be even better. If you can't get any space, or as a second method, you can also get other people to help you read that, and that will be even better because they'll have a completely separate, different perspective from you. So all of that was to say, if you are not understood by the reader, you did not communicate. Putting words on the page does not mean you've communicated. Okay, the first step that I'm going to tell you about is to use fewer words. So a lot of us learn to write at school, and the teacher said, write X number of words, write 400 words or 600 words. and people often padded out their sentences with sort of fat, trashy words that mean nothing, and their goal was simply to get the words up to the word count that the teacher wanted. Well, forget the things your teacher taught you, because teachers weren't trying to necessarily teach you to communicate. They were teaching you the first level of how to communicate, which was how to form sentences, how to make more complicated sentences, how to put more complicated ideas together. But often what we want to do as professional communicators, as adults, is to simplify it back down again. So we want to delete trashy words that we don't really need. And if you go through a document, you can often find that you can delete every time that somebody says "on the other hand," or "specifically," or "however," or "therefore," or "it should be noted that," or "it is noteworthy that," or all kinds of fat words. If you download my textbooks, you will find that there is a 4-page table in the first green book, Communicating, that has just lists of these words and their replacements. Much more simple, or simply delete them. Now, an interesting thing is redundancies and repetition. Do you want to repeat things or not? If you're doing marketing or persuasive essays, you may have been taught that you repeat the ideas. And if you're a politician, that in fact might be the perfect thing to do. But in most writing, instead of repeating information, make it easy to find. So, for example, somebody who's doing a research paper or a technical report might begin with an introduction, and they'll state the point of their introduction. And this is how we were taught to do it at school. And then they'll tell us all the research, and they'll restate their points. And then in the conclusion, they will state it a third time. Now, to some extent, you do want to concisely state your points, but you don't want to do it too often, and you don't want to do it verbatim. Your introduction should not be exactly the same as your conclusion. I often see that technical writers have copy and pasted sections, and that's insulting to your reader. There's no need to do that. Something that you can do if you're worried that you need information that you've referred to before is make your structure of your paper extremely clear. So use headings that clearly mark where everything is. Have a table of contents so that when somebody says, "Oh yeah, where did I see that table again?" they should be able to easily flip to it, either because you've numbered your tables and it's clear to flip through a report, or because there's a table of contents that they can quickly click to that table. Just make it clear. Don't make it insultingly repetitive. And this is different in the digital age than it might have been 40 years ago. We're not having a big stack of papers that someone has to flip through, and so you need to repeat things in section 2 that you had in section 1. One thing that I will mention here that you might want to repeat is that if you are using any abbreviations or acronyms and you haven't used it in quite a while, there is a case to repeat that so that the reader can remember without having to flip around to find that information. So use your best discretion. Now, step number 2. So the first step was we use fewer words. Now, the second step is use more elegant words. So again, this is a real legacy of high school teachers telling us to use larger and larger words, which just ends up making it obfuscatory. Sounds very academic, but it doesn't sound very pleasant. If you really want to impress clients, the public, or any other audience that you have, really, keep it simple. The more simply you can state your message, the better it will be received. Something that grant proposal reviewers often comment on is that when somebody doesn't know what they're talking about, they use extremely complicated language, and you really have to wade through a lot of mud to try to get to the point, because sometimes the writer, does not even know what they meant to write. People who really know their point, they know what research or they know what science they've just done, or they know what engineering principles they're relying on, just write it simply. They have a clear vision of what they want to do, and that comes through in the way that they write about it. So strive for that. Here's some examples of elegant, stylish words compared to important sounding words. So you will see all kinds of reports that people will say, the utilization of the concrete was 4.0 meters per whatever. You really only have to say, we used 4.0 cubic meters per length of distance. There's no reason to use utilization of. These words on the left also often add extra words because they've taken a noun like use, they've changed it to utilize, which just means use, and then they changed it into utilization, so then they had to add another verb. There's more extensive explanation of this in my textbook again, but the basic point is, don't do it. When you can use the more simple word, you will find that you can take word documents full of words on the left and change those paragraphs dramatically by slimming them down to the words on the right-hand side, and it just becomes much more pleasant to read. Now, if you look at this page, it's got a cloud on it, a big gray cloud, and it's got a small green word that says jargon. Jargon is something that marketing people really like. It's something that business people like because it makes them feel like they're part of the in crowd. It's something that scientists might use to communicate with other scientists. Basically, jargon is something that puts you in an in crowd with all the other people who do know your jargon. The people who don't know your jargon are left on the outside of your circle. So obviously, if you're trying to communicate with clients, or if you're trying to communicate with students, or anybody, if you're leaving them on the outside of your circle with your back turned to them and you're talking to all the other experts, you are not succeeding in your communication. So what do we do about jargon? We explain it, and then it's no longer jargon. So here's an example. I want you to look at this example and find out where is the jargon. So when we first draft our thoughts, particularly with complex subjects, such as in oil and gas reports, we often repeat ourselves. So that's what I was talking about in the beginning, and we write garbage, right? That's fine, it's normal. Edit to clarify. Use signposting to clearly mark important ideas. Reports are not speeches. Clarity trumps repetition. So this is something that we saw before, slightly reworded. And the word that we don't want to be using here that's causing difficulty is the word signposting, because not everybody will know what signposting means. And you can kind of guess what it means. So in a class full of students, most people will not raise their hand and say they do not understand that word. But however, they probably don't understand that word. So signposting in educational textbooks would mean that we would refer to the concept to highlight for the student, hey, we're going to talk about balancing equations now. And we would explicitly say, we are going to balance equations now. So that might be something that would be appropriate in what you're writing. For example, if you're writing a letter to your grandmother, you might say, now I'm going to tell you about what we did on Saturday. So as opposed to just leaping into what you did on Saturday, you have a sentence that says, I'm going to tell you what we did on Saturday. It just makes it that little bit clearer so that people don't need to think about what you said. Another easy thing of signposting that you might have already guessed is headings. So you structure your document and you put nice bold headings, and the headings appear in the table of contents, and people can clearly see what the structure of your document is and what you've spoken about just by reading the headings. Step number 4, another kind of cloud is acronyms. Again, loved by certain business types of people, and in certain consulting groups, people will get their acronyms that they love. The problem, again, is that when you're using an acronym and you have not explained your acronym, it's like you're standing in a huddle of people with your back to your audience, and they don't understand what you're talking about. So where is the acronym on this page? It's at the very bottom there, KIS. To impress clients, remember KIS, which many people might know means keep it simple, or the more rude one is keep it simple, stupid, KISS. There's no reason to put an acronym here. It's easier to just write keep it simple. So when would it be appropriate to use an acronym? Because they are appropriate sometimes. So here's some rules. Eliminate abbreviations that I've used less than 3 times. So for example, when we had KIS, we only used it once. Just spell it out. If you've used things a lot, then we might use an acronym. Define other terms at the first use. And perhaps again, as I said, you can repeat that if you go to the 20th page and you haven't used your acronym since the 2nd page. I definitely believe in spelling that out again so that your reader doesn't have to flick back to remember what it was. If you have to use a lot of acronyms and you can't get around it, consider making a list that appears at the front of your report. And if you are working on the kind of reports that use a lot of acronyms, I suggest that you invest in the software, which is not very expensive, called Perfect It. This software developer is an editor, and he's developed this software 10 or 15 years ago, and he's really on top of constantly perfecting it and responding to user needs. It's really good for making sure that you spelled out the acronym the first time, that you've always used the same acronym, that you haven't used one acronym to mean more than one thing, which is also a problem. So that's a very excellent tool if you need that. So here's an example of somewhere that I would use an acronym, because we have a long word, steam-assisted gravity drainage, which is a way of pumping oil by pumping steam into the pipe. Now, if in this paragraph, you can see it's already used 3 times. One solution, if you have acronyms so often, is to try and edit out some of the acronyms. It's a little bit difficult in this case. So it is very good to use the acronym rather than having spelled out 12 extra words in this paragraph, which would have made it a whole line longer. So now that I've told you what signposting is, we can discuss it some more. Clear headings mean so much for the readability of a report. A well-organized report, your reader should be able to just look at the table of contents or just skim the headings and have a map of where you've been and where you're going and feel very comfortable about that. The table of contents is also invaluable for the writer, because if you use the style feature to put the headings, and contact me if you don't know how to do that, use the style feature to put the headings, and then you ask it to develop a table of contents. It will tell you how many pages you have put on each section. And you might notice when you look at that, that you've made, say, 12 to 14 pages describing the calculations or why you've chosen the variables in a certain simulation that you're going to run. I've definitely seen scientists do that, get very excited about their variables and spend 14 pages on it. That might be appropriate if it's a 200-page report, but I've seen people do it in a 19-page report, and so that's not appropriate. And the table of contents map can help you realize if you have the correct volume of content, balancing out what's important in your presentation. Now, another really good tip, which you are not going to get from the baby boomers in your office unless they're very hip and reading ahead, is that people now read the web. In fact, more and more, what we write now is being published on the web. And because people are used to reading the web, there are some changes in the way we write. So the internet uses at least 1/3 less text than your typical print article or print report. So we always are wanting to trim down the words, for example, in trimming the trash and other strategies that are in the textbooks that you can download. Paragraph after paragraph after paragraph, page after page after page used to be okay. It's not really okay for the modern reader. And it's not that they're lazy. You know, in Chaucer's time, in the 1300s, the average sentence length was 82 words. It's now about 8 words. But if you think about it, the people who read in the 13th century were monks. They had quiet, they had not very many duties, they had no children, they had no noise, they had no traffic. All they had to do was read, write, pray, garden, and eat, and sleep. They didn't have to juggle parenting. They didn't have to check their Facebook. They didn't have to attend to multiple phone calls and interruptions from emails. So we do have to attend to those distractions now. And as respect for that distracted way of life that we have in the modern age, keep your sentences short. Keep your paragraphs short. Make it interesting with different visuals. So you can put bulleted lists, like this is a bulleted list. You can put a photo or a map. You can use a table. There's lots of different things that you can do so that you're not handing your reader solid walls of text. So here's an example of a solid wall of text that's an email. And this is a very typical example that I would see from somebody that I might edit for, who I will then hear complain around the office that the client never gets back to them, or the client responds and has only answered one question. If you look at this email, just your eyes kind of blur because you don't really want to read the whole thing. You think, I don't know how many questions. I see 2 question marks, so maybe there's 2 questions. I don't know. You kind of see that, you rush it off, you send a reply, and you go on to the next thing. So let's think of 5 things we could do to improve this email. Be quiet for a second, or maybe you can pause your video to think about what you could do. So here's the answer. First thing, always make sure that your subject line refers to what's in the email. And we are all guilty of making a mistake on that sometimes. I am myself. It's really important to put a correct subject header, not just for when the reader receives it this time, but also so that they can refer back to it in their email inbox. So for example, if you're sending an invoice, make sure that it says invoice. If you're sending something about Cold Creek Hills project, say that in the subject. Second piece that I suggest for this is that we actually use the word hello. Use a greeting. Don't just put the person's name. It's considered abrupt. And depending what culture the reader is from, it's very multicultural. These days in most nations, it's nice to be polite. Always err on the side of politeness, just for good human relations and good business. Second, as you can already see, there's obviously 3 questions, but let's say that. If you need 3 answers before you can proceed, say that you need 3 answers. Good business strategy, tell the person you need those answers by a deadline. Don't make the deadline too far away because they will shove it aside and forget about it. Make the deadline fairly immediate, within a day or 2 or an hour or 2, depends on what business you are, how frequent your communication is. Using the word please is always a good friendly thing to do. Then we have the 3 questions. Then we have a nice ending saying thank you, which is again friendly. If you aren't the kind of person who wants to say thank you, you could say regards, sincerely, something polite. And then we have the name, we have the email, just in case this has been printed off, you don't want them to have to go hunt around again, and the phone number, because on a project like this with a storage tank and transport trucks, you would want the client to be able to contact you. Don't fall into the trap of thinking, oh, they should have me on speed dial. They should have put me into speed dial. They might not have put you into speed dial. Don't assume that they have. Just give them the phone number every single time and they don't have to look up for it. Here's another example of presenting a lot of information in a brief way. So if you ignore the image for a little minute here and just look at numbers 1 to 7, you can imagine if we wrote that as 7 paragraphs on a white piece of paper, it would be deadly dull. We drill 2 horizontal wells, one above the other, deep underground until we reach the oil. Steam is used to liquefy the oil and separate it from the sand. Without the image, this is not compelling reading. But with the image, it's really cool Because we look, okay, step number 1, and your eye traces, there's the pipe where step number 1 is happening. There's the 2 horizontal wells, one's above the other. We drill right down to the level where the oil is. We put in the steam in step number 2. It's compelling, it's easy to understand, it's easy to remember, and it would be very easy for your reader to read this, turn around, and discuss it with somebody else. These same words on a page, on just a white page without the image, would not have that same effect. So be creative. You may have tons of pages that have numbers 1 to 7 on a blank white page. If you want to be the premier professional in your office, you be the one who thinks up the image. You be the one who suggests it. And you may have somebody in your office who's going to say, oh, but we don't do that. That's not really possible. We can't do that. We don't have an artist. We don't have a department. You know, you could even craft up something like this using the boxes on Microsoft Word, just to even create the 7 boxes and a sketch map. It doesn't have to look really great. It just has to put the information in a compelling format. So don't be afraid to create. Another step on Think Visual is, these are other places that you could use it. So explaining new technologies, a map or a diagram. So again, let's think about the letter to grandma. You could put a map to show her, yeah, I went out to the coffee shop today, and I came back and I went around the corner to the secondhand clothes shop. You know, grandma doesn't need that map, but I mean, it would be fun, wouldn't it? So you said, gee, grandma, I went out to the coffee shop, then I went around the corner to the clothes shop, and then I went over to the grocery store. And if you're living in a town where grandma's never been, you could just make a little sketch of the 2 blocks and draw a little line where you went, a little cartoon girl with the little skirt. I mean, why not? It just makes it more fun. And writing should be fun. Procedures, as we just saw on the last slide, are an excellent place to use diagrams. It just helps people to see rather than just to try and read it. A lot of people do not get images very easily from reading. If you give them the image, they will remember what you wanted them to know. Relationships between people in organizations are also a good spot to slip in a diagram. White space. So look at this. I'll give you a second. Tell me how many things this paragraph is asking you to do. Okay, I gave you a second. Not an easy task. You might have counted the periods and guessed at that. Because you use visual cues. We use visual cues more than we will read everything. I'm sure there were some very keen people who read every sentence and would figure it out. But we can make it easier because we're not aiming for the smartest people among our readers. We're aiming to get our message across even to the laziest, most distracted, or most exhausted reader. Now, without even reading this, how many things are we asked? 4. There's 4 bulleted points. So when you dump your thoughts down on the page, they might come out as a few 6-line sentences. That's okay. As you get organized, go back and make sure that each sentence contains 1 easily digestible idea. The important ideas are at the front or the back of paragraphs. Parallel ideas show up in bulleted lists as appropriate, and like ideas are grouped together. There's 4 excellent strategies for writing. Here's another use of white space that you might not have known. This particularly comes from people that are trying to write for either children or English second language people. Newspapers, as you know, don't just have the writing going all the way across the broadsheet. They have the text in columns. And that's because readability experts have determined that there's a column width that's easy to read. If you're working with a company template in a corporate situation, they probably have already done this for you. But if you're designing a magazine or you're designing a leaflet to go out for your small business, think about this. What if you make 2 columns of smaller width? Or what if you make, as I did on this page, a smaller column with some white spaces on the side? Or a column on the left-hand side, a photo on the right-hand side. That would be much easier to read than a broad, shallow one at the top and then a large photo below it. It's just good tricks to use. Fonts and line space. Also, definitely plenty of studies on this one. Arial, Calibri, and Times New Roman are very readable font choices. Use them. When in doubt, use them. Some fonts on Word that are available to everybody look like Gothic script or cartoon script or circus script, and they might look exciting, but they're a bad choice. Don't use them on your business card. Don't use them on signs. Don't use them on information that you want people to read and understand. You'll just turn people away if it's too difficult to read. Thanks to the internet, people are used to typical readable line spacing of 1.15 and a space between paragraphs. It really is better not to monkey around with that. So, although here I see it hasn't come out exactly right, that's my laziness. So 1.15 you will see pops right up on your Microsoft Word as an option. That's pretty standard, and it just makes it more readable than if you squash it right down to 1.0 with computer-generated word processors now. It's just not going to be as readable. Now, something that I didn't write words about on this presentation, but is also important to know, is that a lot of people who learn to use typewriters first put 2 spaces after a period. Now, if you use 2 spaces after a period and you're using a computer word processor, it will make what's called rivers of white space in your text, because the space after the period will end up being much more than 2 spaces. And that actually ends up distracting readers' eye and making a text harder to read. Believe it or not, the studies are in. Here's an example of putting space in between the paragraphs. So what's on the left might be something that we would typically see in the past. Thanks to the internet, what's on the right, as you can see, it's the same font size, it's the same amount of words, it's the exact same words, in fact. It might be good for you to pause the video at this point and just assess how easy it is to look at the right-hand text compared to the left-hand text. And another good point about good writing is that we will skim, and this is especially true of modern readers, we skim that first line of each paragraph. So when somebody reads this, especially somebody who's in a hurry, like an executive on the top floor of the building, they'll do this. We have all read sentences like, skip to the next paragraph, but it is thought and it is concluded are weasel words, and they allow the author to slip out of the reader's grasp. Okay, so I know, even though I've only read 20% of that text, that we're talking about the words that a person uses in a sentence and how that affects readers. Now, as you can see there, The Subtleties of Scientific Style by Matthew Stevens is a fantastic, funny, and highly erudite book. Matthew Stevens has been editing for scientific authors all over the world for 30 or 40 years now. He's just a great guy. And you can get his book for free. Actually, also you can get that book for free on SolaRosaTech.com. On the same page, you can download my textbooks. Step number 9, bulleted lists and a particular application to safety. This bullet came about because I had to edit lots of people who were supposed to be writing site safety documents for people in the field. Now, people in the field often are blue-collar workers. They haven't got the same practice as university people might have of reading long, long reports or long essays or academic papers. Also, people in the field might be in a rainstorm, in a windstorm, in sun. They might be rushing through reading safety documents while they're sitting in traffic. You don't know, but the point is, safety documents need to be easily read. And sometimes I would see, particularly, I saw one for the operation of a truck and something that somebody was supposed to do, all these 25 points about the truck. And they were randomly assorted, 25 bullet points on a page. Very unpleasant to read. They didn't have a checkbox beside them or anything. Much easier if you, first of all, break them into 7 items of each. Of course, that's going to automatically make you think I should categorize them, so it makes a bit of sense why I've put each 7 there. Number things that need to be remembered and discussed. So for example, you might have 4 points about checking the windows, or 4 points about checking all the different lighting that you can have on the truck. Check the trailer lights, check the brake lights, check the signal lights, check the headlights. Those should all be numbered points that somebody could check off. If you make your grammar and punctuation parallel, that makes the reading easier. If you're constantly flipping around because you haven't edited it, it just makes it harder to read. So just take the time to make that consistent on something as important as a safety document. Now there's an even better step. I'm not sure if anybody listening is thinking of it, but if you actually had a diagram of the truck and you used a box, just like in that SAG-D diagram that we looked at, and you said, here are the 4 checkpoints for the lights, and you had the check box and you had an arrow pointing to it, and then you said, here are the 3 things that you need to know about the brakes, and you had a box that was titled brakes, nice and signposted, that would be even more memorable for the person who needs to use the safety document. And that could be a laminated piece of hard paper that somebody would just check off with a marker, and it would be very usable, and a lot more usable than a piece of paper buried in a binder that's randomly assorted. Formatting and safety. So here's another example of, this is a real life example. There was an airline, I think it was in the 80s, and it fell out of the sky. So Klaus Hofer is a foremost safety and literacy writer. He looks at how we use words and how it keeps people safe. And he tells a story about this airplane, and there were a pilot and a co-pilot. Maybe it was 2 co-pilots. It was a large airline. They were in the air, and there was an orange light flashing that they had never seen flashing before. And so the pilot wasn't that concerned because the light was orange, and they kept on flying, and he asked the co-pilot to look it up. And before the co-pilot looked it up, the engine did explode, and a couple of hundred people lost their lives because it was an extremely serious situation. When they did the obviously legal proceedings and investigation about this crash, they found out that the piece of information that the co-pilot would have needed to find was on something like page 135 of a 250-page binder. Not reasonable for an emergency situation. Not reasonable at all. So partly due to that and other studies, Klaus Hofer and others have developed a system where you ask a question and you give a response. So here's an example of the kind of safety document I have seen written by people, and they have sent it out to the field. Well, on the GABU site, apply salt to areas that ice up. Clampons are provided. Ensure handrails are there. Maintain situational awareness. Vehicles underwater. It's disgusting, right? It's a schmozzle. It's not professional. Now, interestingly, Klaus Hofer in his safety workshops talks about the European countries where you could get thrown into jail for putting something like this out into the field. And it should be prosecutable. This is not a safe thing to send out and expect people to read and use. And there are certain courts that are now holding people responsible for that. Here's the same information. Way less words, way more white space, and it's organized into categories. So, safety at the GABU site, the reader knows automatically what we're talking about in 4 words. Ice, 3 of those points were about ice. Salt the areas that ice up, give visitors ice boot clampons, and provide handrails. Situational awareness, be vigilant for vehicles from all directions, and present a strong posture and determined gaze to deter muggers. Obviously, this was in a site that must have had some problems. Could have been organized better, but this is an example of categorizing it at least. So here's a summary of what we've talked about. The first thing that we discussed was, are you talking to the reader about what the reader wants to know? Let them know what you're talking about. Don't just leap straight into it. Tell grandma, now I'm going to tell you what I did on Saturday. Tell your readers, now we're talking about safety on the Gaboo site. Use fewer words to get the same message across, because it will be better read and better remembered. Use more simple words. Again, they'll be better read and better remembered. Number 3, don't use jargon. Or if you do use a word that could be jargon, make sure that you explain it. As soon as you explain it, you're bringing your client or your reader into that circle with the rest of you. You're not turning their back on them anymore. If you use acronyms, be thoughtful about it. Use them in places that they're necessary, but when you've only used it a few times, just spell the words out. Organization is so key to whether something is readable or impossible. Take the time to, again, some people will organize at the first draft stage. Some people might just write things down and then organize afterwards. The best thing to do would be to organize before you write it, and then reassess it and reorganize it after you write it to make sure that you've achieved the goals that you want. Get visual whenever you can. Replace blocks of text with images, with bulleted lists, with tables, with things that have white space. Which again is use white space and design it so that it's interesting to read. Use bullets. Don't just use bullets because they're easier to read, but they're also safer to read. And use formatting. Again, something that's well read is going to be safer to use. I hope this has been useful to you. And again, my name is Krista Bedwin. My webpage and places where you can download resources are at the beginning of this presentation. Please contact me if you have any questions and share this with your friends. Thank you.